The real reason you can't stop overthinking. Introduction. It was never about the thinking. Here is the first and most important thing this book will tell you: overthinking is not a thinking problem. This statement is counterintuitive enough that it is worth pausing on. When we call something overthinking, we seem to be diagnosing a problem with the quantity or quality of thought. Too much of it, too circular, too unproductive. And the obvious prescription seems to follow naturally: think less. Think more efficiently. Redirect your thoughts. Stop the mental chatter. But this framing, however intuitive, misidentifies both the problem and its solution. Overthinking is not fundamentally a cognitive phenomenon. It is, at its root, an emotional and physiological one, a symptom of a nervous system that does not feel safe, expressing itself through the organ most available to conscious awareness, the mind. Think about it this way. When you are overthinking, what is happening underneath the thoughts? What is the quality of the internal experience before your mind reaches for the next replay of the painful conversation, the next worst-case scenario, the next catalog of your failures? In almost every case, if you look carefully, there is a feeling, a subtle but persistent sense of unease, vulnerability, or threat. The thoughts are not the primary event. They are the response to something that is happening at a deeper level of the organism. This is why the standard advice about overthinking, stop ruminating, distract yourself, challenge your negative thoughts, provides, at best, temporary relief. It addresses the symptom while leaving the underlying state unchanged. The uneasy nervous system that generated the overthinking in the first place simply generates it again, sometimes louder, when the distraction fades. What overthinking actually is. Overthinking, as we will use the term throughout this book, refers to a specific pattern of mental activity, sustained, repetitive, self-focused thought that does not progress toward resolution or useful insight. It has two primary forms, which researchers and clinicians generally distinguish as rumination and worry. Rumination is backward-looking. It circles around past events, past mistakes, past conversations, past versions of yourself that you wish were different. It asks, why did that happen? What does it mean about me? What should I have done differently? It is characterized by a sense of stuckness, of being unable to let go of something that cannot be changed. Worry is forward-looking. It projects into possible futures, constructing scenarios of threat, failure, loss, or humiliation, and then examining those scenarios for evidence of how bad they might be. It asks, what if this goes wrong? What if I'm not ready? What if they don't like me? It is characterized by a sense of urgency, of needing to think more in order to be prepared for what might come. Both rumination and worry share a common architecture. They are self-referential about you and your relationship to events. They are repetitive, covering the same ground repeatedly. They are not solution-focused in any productive sense. They generate more thought rather than insight or action, and they are sustained by an underlying emotional state that feeds them. Both leave you feeling exhausted, disconnected, and, ironically, no more prepared or resolved than when you started. The central argument. The central argument of this book is that overthinking is maintained by four interconnected factors, each of which has deep roots in human psychology, neuroscience, and developmental history. The first is a nervous system that has been calibrated toward threat detection, either through genetic temperament, early experience, trauma, or the chronic stresses of modern life, and that therefore registers uncertainty, ambiguity, and interpersonal complexity as potential dangers requiring constant monitoring. The second is an emotional landscape that has not been fully processed, where feelings that were too large, too complex, or too threatening to be experienced directly have been converted into thought. In this model, overthinking is not merely a companion to unprocessed emotion, it is a substitute for it, a way of staying close to the feeling without actually having to feel it. The third is an identity structure that is organized around performance, approval, or control, structures that make uncertainty intolerably threatening and that therefore require constant mental management to maintain. The fourth is a cultural and environmental context that valorizes productivity, pathologizes rest, rewards anxious preparation, and provides an endless supply of stimuli to feed the ruminating mind. These four factors interact and reinforce each other, creating the self-perpetuating loop that makes overthinking so difficult to simply decide to stop. Breaking the loop requires addressing each of these factors, not by fighting the thoughts, but by changing the conditions that make them necessary. That is what this book is for. Chapter 1. The Overthinking Paradox. Why your brain won't let go. Let us begin with a paradox. The very act of trying to stop overthinking almost always makes it worse. This is not merely anecdotal. It is one of the most replicated findings in cognitive psychology, documented most powerfully by the psychologist Daniel Wegner in his research on thought suppression. In his now famous White Bear experiments, Wegner asked participants to not think about a white bear for 5 minutes. The result was consistent and somewhat amusing. The instruction to suppress the thought made participants think about white bears more, not less. When the suppression period ended, there was often a rebound effect. The suppressed thought flooded back with greater frequency than it had appeared before. The mechanism Wegner proposed, which he called ironic process theory, is elegant. Any effort to suppress a thought requires a monitoring process that searches for instances of the forbidden thought in order to suppress them. This monitoring process, precisely because it is looking for the thought, keeps the thought activated in the mental background, making it more likely to appear. The harder you try not to think about something, the more cognitively available that something becomes. This is the first layer of the overthinking paradox. The mind that is trying not to overthink is itself a busy mind, and its busyness generates more material for the overthinking loop it is trying to interrupt. The negativity bias. Why the mind clings to the unpleasant. To understand why the mind returns, again and again, to the same uncomfortable territory, we need to understand one of the most fundamental features of human cognition, the negativity bias. The negativity bias refers to the well-documented tendency for negative experiences, information, and emotions to have a greater psychological impact than positive ones of equivalent magnitude. Negative events are processed more thoroughly, remembered more vividly, and exert more influence on behavior and judgment than comparably positive events. The insult remembered long after the compliment has been forgotten. The single critical comment that drowns out a dozen expressions of appreciation. The mistake replayed after the successes have been consigned to history. These are all expressions of the negativity bias in action. From an evolutionary perspective, the negativity bias makes perfect sense. For our ancestors, negative events, predators, spoiled food, hostile strangers, carried survival-relevant information that warranted close attention and thorough processing. The cost of under-attending to a threat was potentially fatal. The cost of over-attending to a positive experience was merely the opportunity cost of not finding another positive experience. The system that evolved to keep us alive therefore weighted negative signals heavily and positive ones lightly. In the modern environment, where most of us are not navigating physical threats on a daily basis, the negativity bias continues to operate in full force but is applied to the social, professional, and psychological concerns that populate our lives. The mind that replays the awkward moment at the party, the performance review where something critical was said, the relationship conflict that ended ambiguously, this mind is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is processing what it perceives as threat-relevant information with the thoroughness that threats deserve. The problem is that this design, perfect for its original context, is dramatically mismatched with the texture of modern life. The social slight is not a predator. The professional criticism is not a poison. The ambiguous text message is not an indicator of imminent physical danger. But the negativity-biased brain cannot always tell the difference, and it responds to perceived social and psychological threats with the same vigilant, repetitive processing that it would devote to a genuine survival emergency. The Zeigarnik effect. Why unfinished business haunts the mind. Another key mechanism behind the sticky quality of overthinking is what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, named after the Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik who discovered it in the 1920s. The effect is simple. We remember incomplete tasks and unresolved situations more readily than completed or resolved ones. The mind maintains what amounts to a mental to-do list of unfinished business, and items on that list remain cognitively activated, available, even intrusive, until they are resolved. For the overthinker, this mechanism is a significant source of suffering. The unresolved relationship conflict, the unanswered question about whether someone is angry with you, the ambiguous outcome of an important conversation, all of these remain open loops in the mind's filing system, generating repeated, intrusive returns to the unfinished business as the mind attempts to process them toward closure. The cruel irony is that many of the situations that trigger the most intense overthinking are precisely those that cannot be resolved by thinking, because they involve other people's minds, future events, or past moments that cannot be changed. The mind keeps returning to them in search of the closure that the Zeigarnik effect demands, but the closure it seeks is not available through thought. And so the loop continues. The illusion of mental preparedness. One of the most powerful reasons the mind persists in overthinking is a belief, often implicit and unexamined, that the thinking is doing something useful. That if you just replay the conversation one more time, you'll figure out the right interpretation. That if you model the catastrophic scenario thoroughly enough, you'll be prepared when it happens. That if you can identify exactly what went wrong, you'll prevent it from happening again. This belief, that overthinking is a form of problem solving or preparation, is one of the most effective traps in the overthinker's experience. It provides a functional justification for what is, in practice, a dysfunctional cycle. The mind convinces itself that the repetitive revisiting of painful territory is productive work rather than the expression of unresolved fear that it actually is. Research on worry specifically has examined this belief extensively. Studies consistently find that people who worry believe that worrying helps them cope, prevents bad outcomes, or motivates them to take action. And while there is a grain of truth in this, some degree of anticipatory planning is genuinely useful, the research is equally clear that the kind of circular, unproductive worry that characterizes overthinking provides none of these benefits. It does not improve preparation, it does not prevent bad outcomes, and its primary effect on motivation is to paralyze it. The illusion of mental preparedness is particularly powerful because it is occasionally, partially, accidentally reinforced. Sometimes, after many hours of anxious rehearsal, an important conversation does go relatively smoothly, and the overthinker concludes that the preparation worked. What they cannot know is whether the conversation would have gone equally well with 30 minutes of preparation rather than 3 weeks of anxious rumination. The mind takes credit for outcomes it did not determine and continues its labors. The completion drive and why resolution feels impossible. Beneath the Zeigarnik effect lies a deeper drive, the mind's fundamental orientation toward completion, toward narrative coherence, toward making meaning of experience. Human beings are, above all, meaning-making creatures. We do not simply experience events. We organize them into stories, assign them causes and consequences, extract lessons and implications, and integrate them into our ongoing understanding of who we are and how the world works. Overthinking is, in part, a meaning-making process gone awry. The mind is doing what it is supposed to do, trying to integrate a difficult experience into a coherent narrative, but it is doing it without the emotional processing that would allow genuine integration to occur. Without access to the feelings beneath the thoughts, the mind circles the experience without ever fully digesting it, the way a stomach might churn around food that it cannot break down. This metaphor points toward the central insight of this book. The reason you can't stop overthinking is not that you think too much. It is that you feel too little, or rather, that the feelings available at the surface are not the deeper feelings that the overthinking is actually trying to address. Getting to those feelings is the work. Everything else is preparation for that work, or avoidance of it. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Rumination. What's happening in your brain? For most of human history, people understood the restless mind through the language of philosophy, religion, and metaphor. The Buddhist concept of monkey mind the incessantly chattering mental activity that leaps from thought to thought like a monkey through trees, captures something real about the phenomenology of overthinking. The Stoic practice of distinguishing between what is and is not, up to us points toward one of the most effective cognitive interventions available. But neither tradition had access to the neuroimaging technology and experimental methods that have, in recent decades, begun to reveal the actual biological architecture of the ruminating mind. What modern neuroscience has discovered is both humbling and illuminating. The restless mind is not a failure of character or a weakness of will. It is the expression of specific neural systems doing specific things, and understanding those systems is essential to understanding why overthinking is so persistent, and what it actually takes to change it. The default mode network, your brain's idle state. One of the most significant discoveries in modern neuroscience is the default mode network, DMN, a set of interconnected brain regions that become active when we are not focused on the external world. When you are not engaged in a task that demands external attention, when your mind wanders, when you daydream, reflect on your past, imagine your future, or think about other people, your DMN is active. The DMN includes the medial prefrontal cortex, associated with self-referential thought and social cognition, the posterior cingulate cortex, associated with self-reflection and autobiographical memory, the angular gyrus, associated with language and conceptual thought, and several other regions. Together, these areas constitute a network that is specialized for exactly the kinds of thought that characterize overthinking: self-focused, narrative-oriented, past and future-directed mental activity. In people who do not struggle with excessive rumination, the DMN activates during mind wandering and quiets when attention is directed to external tasks, a healthy, flexible alternation between internal and external focus. In people who struggle with depression, anxiety, and chronic overthinking, the DMN shows several characteristic differences. It is more active at baseline, it is less effectively inhibited by external task demands, it shows stronger connectivity between its regions, meaning its patterns are more entrenched, and it is more likely to generate self-critical, ruminative content. Understanding the DMN reframes overthinking in an important way. It is not random or purposeless. It is the expression of a highly developed neural system for self-referential, social, and narrative thought, a system that is essentially on overdrive, either because it is naturally more active, because it has been habituated toward ruminative patterns, or because the underlying emotional state that feeds it has not been resolved. The amygdala and the threat detection system. No account of overthinking can be complete without a thorough understanding of the amygdala, the almond-shaped cluster of nuclei deep in the temporal lobes that serves as the brain's primary threat detection and emotional alarm system. The amygdala processes emotional signals with extraordinary speed, faster than conscious awareness, and triggers the stress response, the cascade of hormones and physiological changes we commonly call fight or flight, when it detects potential danger. What is crucial for our purposes is that the amygdala does not distinguish reliably between physical and psychological threats. A social rejection, a professional humiliation, a perceived loss of love or status, these activate the amygdala's alarm system with the same urgency as a physical threat would, because for a deeply social species like humans, social threats have historically been genuinely dangerous. To be excluded from the group, to lose status and reputation, to experience the loss of a critical attachment relationship, these were, for most of human history, potentially fatal events. When the amygdala fires in response to a perceived social or psychological threat, it sets off a chain reaction that is critically relevant to overthinking. It activates the body's stress response, making the organism vigilant, alert, and primed to process threat-relevant information. It activates the hippocampus, facilitating the encoding of emotionally significant memories. And it sends signals to the prefrontal cortex, the brain's seat of rational deliberation, planning, and executive control, that can both enhance attention to the threat and, in states of intense activation, actually impair the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the emotional response. This last point is of fundamental importance. Under moderate stress, the amygdala-prefrontal cortex interaction is productive. It directs focused attention to what matters without overwhelming executive function. But under intense or chronic stress, the amygdala's signal can become so strong that it impairs the prefrontal cortex's regulatory capacity. The thinking mind is, in effect, taken over by the alarm system. Rational deliberation gives way to threat-focused rumination, and the overthinking loop is activated not by choice, but by the hijacking of the cognitive system by a nervous system in chronic alarm. The role of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex (PFC) is the neurological home of our distinctly human capacities: planning, abstract reasoning, impulse control, perspective taking, and, crucially, the ability to regulate our own emotional responses. When the PFC is functioning well and the emotional arousal level is moderate, it can evaluate the amygdala's alarm signals with something like rationality. Is this threat real? Is it as serious as it feels? What is the most constructive response? But the PFC is also the region most sensitive to the effects of chronic stress, fatigue, and emotional dysregulation. Research by Amy Arnsten and others has shown that stress hormones, particularly cortisol, actually impair PFC functioning, reducing the density of synaptic connections in PFC regions and degrading the quality of executive control. A chronically stressed brain is not equally capable of regulating its own emotional responses as a rested, calm one. The very situation that most needs the PFC's regulatory capacity, chronic stress and rumination, is also the situation that most degrades the PFC's ability to provide it. This creates a neurobiological vicious cycle that is at the heart of chronic overthinking. Stress degrades PFC function. Degraded PFC function reduces the ability to regulate the emotional arousal that drives rumination, and regulated emotional arousal sustains the stress response. Sustained stress further degrades PFC function. And so the ruminating mind, despite its best efforts at rational self-talk, often finds those efforts insufficient, not because the thinker is weak or irrational, but because the very organ needed for effective self-regulation has been compromised by the conditions it is trying to manage. Memory, pattern, and the autobiographical self. A third neural system relevant to overthinking is the memory system, particularly the autobiographical memory system that allows us to recall our personal history, to construct a narrative of who we are, and to use that narrative as a lens through which we interpret present experience. The hippocampus, the brain's primary memory consolidation center, works in close partnership with the amygdala. Emotionally charged events, especially those with negative emotional valence, are encoded with particular strength. This is why our most vivid memories are often our most painful ones. The brain treats emotional significance as a marker of memory importance, and negative emotional significance as an especially strong marker. For the overthinker, this means that their autobiographical narrative tends to be disproportionately populated by memories of failure, embarrassment, rejection, and loss, not because those events were more frequent than positive ones, but because they were encoded more deeply and are retrieved more readily. This biased memory landscape shapes how present experiences are interpreted. Ambiguous social signals are read through the lens of past rejection. Uncertain outcomes are evaluated against a catalog of past failures. Present relationships are navigated with the emotional residue of past hurts. The result is a self-narrative that tends toward the negative, a constant process of autobiographical maintenance in which the overthinking mind is not just processing the present but managing a vast, emotionally charged archive of the past. An archive that keeps bleeding into the present through the process of memory retrieval that is itself activated by present emotional states. Neuroplasticity. The good news. Everything we have described so far might seem to paint a picture of a brain that is simply stuck, wired for rumination, incapable of change. This would be a misreading of the neuroscience, and it would be wrong. The most important concept in modern neuroscience, from a practical standpoint, is neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change its structure and function in response to experience. Neural pathways are not fixed at birth or even in early childhood. They are continuously shaped by what we repeatedly think, feel, do, and experience. Every time a set of neurons fires together, the synaptic connections between them are strengthened, a principle sometimes summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. Every time a pattern of thought or behavior is repeated, it becomes more easily activated, more automatic, more ingrained. This is, of course, how ruminative patterns become so entrenched. They have been practiced, involuntarily but relentlessly, over years or decades. The neural highways of overthinking are well traveled and smoothly paved. But neuroplasticity also means that new pathways can be built, that the brain that has learned to ruminate can also learn, with sustained practice, to respond differently to the triggers that have historically sent it down the ruminative road. This is the neurological basis for the hope that pervades this book, even as we look clearly at the difficulty of the problem. The brain changes. You can change how you respond to your thoughts. But the change requires understanding what you are actually changing, and that understanding is what the preceding pages, and those that follow, are designed to provide. Chapter 3. The wound beneath the worry, attachment, trauma, and the restless mind. If you want to understand why a particular person's mind will not quiet, the most important question is not, what are they overthinking about? It is, what happened to them that made uncertainty feel unbearable? This is the central claim of this chapter, and it is one that will be uncomfortable for many readers, not because it is wrong, but because it implies something that our culture strongly resists. That the problem of overthinking is not primarily a problem of the present but of the past. Not primarily a cognitive problem but an emotional and relational one. And not, therefore, one that can be solved by thinking better, but only by healing deeper. Attachment theory and the origins of mental insecurity. The British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst John Bowlby developed what we now call attachment theory in the mid-20th century, initially through his study of the devastating effects of early maternal deprivation on children's development. What he discovered, and what decades of subsequent research have elaborated and confirmed, is that human beings are biologically wired for close emotional bonds with caregivers, and that the quality of those early bonds has profound and lasting effects on the developing nervous system, the emotional regulatory system, and the cognitive patterns that govern how we relate to ourselves and others throughout life. The central concept in attachment theory is the internal working model, the set of implicit beliefs and expectations about the self, others, and the world that develop from early attachment experiences and serve as a template for subsequent relationships and self-understanding. These working models are not primarily cognitive constructs. They are embodied, emotional, largely unconscious patterns that operate below the level of conscious thought. Children who experience consistent, responsive, attuned caregiving develop what Bowlby and his colleague Mary Ainsworth called secure attachment, a working model characterized by the belief that the self is worthy of love and care, that others are reliably available when needed, and that the world is fundamentally safe enough to explore. Securely attached individuals tend to have nervous systems that are well regulated. They can tolerate uncertainty and distress without becoming overwhelmed, and they can return to calm relatively readily after emotional disruption. Children who experience inconsistent, intrusive, neglectful, or frightening caregiving develop various forms of insecure attachment, working models characterized by anxiety about others' availability and reliability, by negative self-assessment, by difficulties with emotional regulation, and by heightened vigilance to social and emotional cues. These insecure attachment patterns are not personal failings, they are adaptive responses to the particular relational environment in which the child developed. But they create a nervous system that is, in a very precise sense, calibrated toward threat, toward the expectation that the next moment may bring abandonment, criticism, or rejection. And a nervous system calibrated toward threat is a nervous system that generates overthinking. The anxious attachment pattern and rumination. Among the insecure attachment patterns, anxious attachment has the closest documented relationship with rumination and overthinking. Individuals with anxious attachment, sometimes called preoccupied attachment in the adult literature, show a characteristic pattern of hypervigilance to relationship cues, excessive worry about their attachment relationships, and a tendency to amplify and prolong emotional distress rather than regulating it effectively. For the anxiously attached individual, uncertainty in a relationship is not just uncomfortable, it is existentially threatening. The working model that has been built on experiences of inconsistent caregiving tells them that people cannot be relied upon, that love and availability might disappear at any moment, and that they must therefore monitor their relationships constantly and work hard to prevent the feared abandonment. This monitoring, this constant scanning of the relational environment for signs of trouble, is, in its cognitive expression, exactly what we call overthinking. The anxiously attached person who replays a conversation to determine whether their partner's tone was slightly cooler than usual, who interprets a delayed text response as evidence of waning interest, who rehearses self-defensive explanations for perceived slights before any confrontation has been called. This person is not being irrational. They are following the logic of a nervous system that learned, very early in life, that love is uncertain and vigilance is survival. The avoidant pattern, overthinking in disguise. Avoidant attachment is less immediately recognizable as a source of overthinking, because people with this pattern have learned to suppress emotional expression and to present an image of independence and self-sufficiency. But suppression is not the same as absence. The emotional material that has been suppressed is still there, and it still requires cognitive management, it simply takes a different form. For the avoidantly attached individual, overthinking often manifests as excessive intellectualization, the conversion of emotional experience into abstract analysis. They may think obsessively about work, about ideas, about the behavior of others, not in the raw, emotionally exposed way of the anxiously attached person, but in a more detached, analytical mode that keeps them busy enough to avoid feeling the underlying emotional states that they were early trained to regard as dangerous or shameful. The avoidant person who cannot stop thinking about their work performance, who analyzes every professional interaction in exhaustive detail, who is unable to relax without the accompaniment of productive thought, this person is also overthinking. The content is different, the function is the same, staying in the mind to stay out of the feelings. Trauma and the hypervigilant mind. Beyond attachment patterns, which exist on a spectrum from secure to insecure and represent variations within the normal range of human experience, there is the specific territory of trauma, which produces some of the most severe and treatment-resistant forms of overthinking. Trauma, as the psychiatrist and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk has extensively documented, is not primarily a memory of a terrible event. It is a physiological disruption, a reorganization of the nervous system's functioning in response to an experience that overwhelmed its regulatory capacity. Traumatic experiences are, by definition, those that exceed the organism's ability to process and integrate them. The result is a nervous system that remains in a state of chronic activation, perpetually alert to the possibility that the catastrophe might recur, long after the original threat has passed. For trauma survivors, overthinking is not just a habit, it is a survival strategy that the nervous system has installed at a physiological level. The hypervigilance that keeps scanning the environment for signs of threat, the intrusive thoughts that replay traumatic material in search of a different outcome, the constant mental rehearsal of self-protective strategies, these are not cognitive choices but involuntary expressions of a nervous system that is still, at some level, living in the time of the original threat. This is why purely cognitive approaches to trauma-related overthinking, approaches that focus on changing the content or pattern of thought, are often insufficient. The overthinking is not primarily cognitive. It is physiological. It requires physiological intervention, which is why somatic approaches to trauma, approaches that work directly with the body's nervous system, are increasingly recognized as essential components of effective trauma treatment. The legacy of emotional invalidation. A specific form of early experience that deserves extended attention as a source of adult overthinking is emotional invalidation, the experience of having one's emotional responses dismissed, criticized, minimized, or denied by caregivers. When a child's emotional experience is consistently invalidated, when they are told that their fear is silly, their sadness is an overreaction, their anger is inappropriate, their joy is embarrassing, several things happen that are directly relevant to later overthinking. First, they learn that their inner experience is not reliable, that what they feel is not an accurate guide to reality, because trusted others consistently tell them otherwise. This creates a fundamental self-doubt that follows them into adulthood, where it manifests as the need to repeatedly check and recheck their perceptions, interpretations, and reactions. Second, they learn to substitute thought for feeling, to analyze their emotional states rather than experience them, to convert the felt sense of their emotional reality into mental concepts that can be evaluated against external standards of appropriateness. This is the beginning of the emotional to cognitive conversion that underlies so much of adult overthinking. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, they develop a deep and persistent anxiety about their own internal states. Not only do they not trust their feelings, they actively fear them. Feelings are the things that got them into trouble as children. Feelings are the things that provoke the invalidating, critical, or dismissive response from caregivers. Feelings are, at some deep level, dangerous. And so the adult who grew up with consistent emotional invalidation develops a mind that runs interference between themselves and their feelings, that generates an endless stream of thought precisely to prevent the experience of the feelings that the thought is supposedly analyzing. To stop overthinking, this person does not need better thinking strategies. They need to learn, probably for the first time, that their feelings are survivable, that they can be felt without being catastrophic, expressed without being punished, and used as information without requiring constant verification against external standards. Chapter 4. The Perfectionism Engine: How Impossible Standards Fuel Endless Thought. There is a version of perfectionism that is visible, almost charming in its intensity: the student who rewrites every sentence of an essay until the last possible moment, the executive who reviews every slide of a presentation a dozen times before delivery, the artist who cannot show a finished work without acute anxiety about its flaws. This is the face of perfectionism that shows up in articles about high achievement and in the self-descriptions of people who say, with a mixture of pride and apology, "I'm a bit of a perfectionist." But there is another version of perfectionism that is less visible and more painful: the perfectionism of the person who cannot make a decision without agonizing over the optimal choice, who cannot end a conversation without reviewing it for evidence of failure, who cannot rest without the uneasy sense that something important is being left undone. This is perfectionism not as a charming personality trait but as a way of being in the world, a fundamental orientation toward experience that makes nearly every moment a potential site of inadequacy and every thought a potential territory of failure. This chapter is about the relationship between perfectionism and overthinking, which is one of the closest and most consequential in the psychological landscape of the ruminating mind. What perfectionism actually is. Perfectionism, as researchers in the field have come to understand it, is not simply high standards or a strong desire to do well. Those are things that virtually everyone has to some degree, and they are generally associated with positive outcomes: higher quality work, greater persistence, more thorough preparation. Perfectionism, as a psychological construct, refers specifically to the combination of excessively high standards with a harsh, critical evaluation of oneself when those standards are not met. Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett, two of the leading researchers in the field, have proposed a multidimensional model of perfectionism that distinguishes between self-oriented perfectionism, extremely high standards for oneself, other-oriented perfectionism, extremely high standards for others, and socially prescribed perfectionism, the belief that others hold extremely high standards for oneself. Of these three dimensions, socially prescribed perfectionism has the strongest relationship to anxiety, depression, and rumination, because it involves a persistent, anxious monitoring of the self against an imagined external standard that is by definition unverifiable and potentially unlimited. The socially prescribed perfectionist does not merely want to do well. They are convinced that others require them to be flawless, and that any evidence of imperfection will result in rejection, criticism, or the withdrawal of love and respect. For them, every performance is audited against an impossible standard maintained in the mind of imagined evaluators who never rest and never offer anything less than the most demanding possible assessment. This is an extraordinarily generative condition for overthinking. Every action, every word, every decision is potential evidence for or against one's adequacy, and the mind must therefore evaluate it exhaustively. The standard that moves. One of the most maddening features of perfectionist overthinking is the way the standard of adequacy relocates whenever it is approached. The perfectionist who finishes a project and briefly experiences the satisfaction of having done it well will, within hours or days, find their attention redirected to its flaws, to what could have been better, what others might criticize, what fell short of the ideal that existed in their imagination before the execution of the project introduced the inevitable impurities of reality. This is what psychologists sometimes call the goalpost moving problem of perfectionism. The standard is always ahead of where one is, always requiring more, always withholding the sense of completion that would allow the mind to rest. The result is a perpetual state of not quite enough, a continuous experience of falling short that generates continuous evaluation, analysis, and remediation planning. The mind can never be quiet because the work of self-improvement is never done, because the standard against which one is being measured is definitionally beyond reach. The relationship between this goalpost moving and overthinking is direct. Every unmet standard creates an open loop that the Zeigarnik effect keeps activated. Every piece of work that is deemed imperfect becomes material for ruminative analysis. Every performance that falls short of the imagined ideal generates retroactive review and forward planning about how to do better next time. The perfectionist mind is essentially always in the middle of a performance review, not because any actual evaluator is present, but because the internal critic never sleeps. Perfectionism is a self-protective strategy. One of the most important insights from the research on perfectionism is that it typically functions, at its core, as a self-protective strategy rather than a genuine aspiration toward excellence. This seems paradoxical. How could holding impossibly high standards protect anyone from anything? The answer lies in the particular logic of shame. Many perfectionists, at the level of their deepest emotional experience, do not believe they are fundamentally adequate. They carry what the researcher and writer Brené Brown has called toxic shame, not the healthy guilt of having done something wrong, but the toxic experience of feeling fundamentally flawed, defective, or unworthy at the level of identity. This is often not a conscious belief. It operates below the level of reflective awareness as a persistent background sense of not honest. Perfectionism develops as a strategy for managing this underlying sense of shame. If I can perform well enough, achieve enough, be impressive enough, I will never have to confront the possibility that I am fundamentally inadequate. As long as my performance is excellent, the question of my worth is held at bay. The perfectionist is therefore not pursuing excellence, they are fleeing shame. The extraordinary effort they devote to achievement is driven not by joy or genuine ambition but by the terror of what might be revealed if they stopped. This reframe has profound implications for overthinking. The perfectionist who cannot stop replaying a performance, analyzing a decision, or reviewing a conversation is not doing so because they want to improve. They are doing so because the subterranean sense of inadequacy that drives their perfectionism has been activated by the possibility, even a remote one, that their performance was less than flawless. The overthinking is the mind's attempt to audit the evidence and determine whether the shame is justified, whether this instance, this performance, this exchange, constitutes proof of the fundamental inadequacy that the perfectionist both fears and, at some level, secretly believes. The connection between perfectionism and procrastination. It is worth noting that perfectionism and procrastination, which seem like opposites, are closely related in the context of overthinking. Procrastination in the perfectionist is typically not laziness or disorganization, it is avoidance of the emotional exposure that beginning or completing a project entails. Starting requires tolerating the gap between the imagined ideal and the imperfect first draft. Finishing requires releasing the project into a world that might judge it. Both the starting and the finishing of projects therefore generate acute anxiety in the perfectionist, and this anxiety generates overthinking. Extended pre-project analysis that substitutes for beginning, I need to think about this more before I start. Extensive mid-project revision that prevents completion, I'll finish when it's right. And intense post-project review that replays and evaluates, did I get it right? What will they think? The project itself becomes almost secondary to the enormous cognitive and emotional labor that surrounds it. Labor that is, in its entirety, driven by the need to manage the shame that might arise if the work is judged inadequate. Chapter 5. The Identity Trap. When you become your thoughts. There is a particular kind of suffering that is unique to people who have unwittingly made their thoughts the center of their identity. These are the people, and they are very common, who describe themselves as a person who thinks too much, as if the overthinking were not something they do but something they are. And in a functional sense, for many people, this is exactly true. Their sense of who they are has become so entangled with the content and activity of their thinking that the prospect of a quiet mind feels not like relief but like threat. This chapter examines the identity trap in overthinking, the ways in which the self becomes organized around thought, why this creates an additional layer of resistance to change, and what a different relationship to the thinking mind might look like. The thinking self as identity. René Descartes' famous declaration, "I think, therefore I am," is not just a philosophical proposition. For many people in Western culture, it is a description of their actual psychological organization. Thinking is treated as the defining activity of the self. The capacity for reflection, analysis, and rational deliberation is regarded as the core of personhood, and the quality and quantity of one's thought is experienced as directly indicative of one's value and competence. This cultural valorization of thinking creates a specific vulnerability in the context of overthinking. If you are, fundamentally, a thinking person, then the cessation of thought, even the cessation of unproductive, painful, circular thought, feels like a diminishment of self. The person who is accustomed to experiencing themselves as thoughtful, intelligent, analytical, and reflective may find that the prospect of mental quiet carries with it an implicit threat to these self-constructs. A quiet mind, in this framework, is not a rested mind. It is a less than mind. This dynamic is particularly pronounced in people who have made their intellectual identity a source of pride, status, or social connection. The philosopher, the analyst, the writer, the scientist, the highly educated professional, all of these identities are organized, in part, around the capacity for sustained, complex thought. For these individuals, mental activity is not just a function, it is a form of self-expression and social communication. To stop thinking, even to stop the kind of thinking that is clearly causing suffering, would require a relinquishment of a core aspect of identity that may feel simply too costly. Thoughts as self-evidence. A related dimension of the identity trap is the tendency to treat the content of one's thoughts as evidence about oneself, specifically, as reliable evidence about one's character, intentions, and worth. I keep thinking about how I might fail, therefore I must be fundamentally inadequate. I can't stop replaying that argument, therefore I must have done something seriously wrong. I keep having catastrophic thoughts, therefore something catastrophic must be about to happen. This tendency, to treat thoughts as facts, is so common that cognitive therapists have given it a name, cognitive fusion. In the ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, framework developed by Stephen Hayes and colleagues, cognitive fusion refers to the condition of being so identified with the content of one's thoughts that one cannot distinguish between, I am having the thought that I am worthless and, I am worthless. The thought and the reality it purports to describe are fused into a single experience. For the overthinker, cognitive fusion is both a cause and a consequence of rumination. It is a cause because treating thoughts as facts gives the thinking mind enormous power. Every thought becomes potentially important, potentially revealing, potentially damning, and therefore worth extended attention and analysis. It is a consequence because the extended attention devoted to thoughts through rumination deepens the sense of their significance, making them seem more real, more weighty, more definitive of who one is. The result is a self-concept that is perpetually at the mercy of the weather of the mind. On days when thoughts are positive, the person feels good about themselves. On days when thoughts are dark, the person feels dark. The identity has been outsourced to the thinking system, and the thinking system, as we have seen, is heavily biased toward negative, threat-focused content, especially under conditions of stress. The safety of knowing versus the freedom of not knowing. Another dimension of the identity trap concerns the relationship between overthinking and certainty. Many chronic overthinkers describe a profound need to know, to have things resolved, analyzed, categorized, and settled, that goes far beyond ordinary curiosity or the practical need for accurate information. For these individuals, not knowing is not merely uncomfortable. It is experienced as a kind of existential destabilization, a threat to the sense of being a person who has their situation under control. The mind that cannot tolerate not knowing is a mind that will work constantly to generate knowing, that will analyze and reanalyze situations until a definitive interpretation emerges, that will construct elaborate explanatory frameworks to account for ambiguous behavior, that will rehearse future scenarios until it feels confident about what will happen. This is overthinking in the service of certainty, and it is, paradoxically, the least effective possible path to the certainty it seeks, because the situations that most demand this kind of mental effort are precisely those that are genuinely uncertain and therefore resistant to resolution through thought. The identity dimension of this pattern is that the need for certainty is often tied to a self-concept organized around competence and control. The person who sees themselves as someone who understands things, who has accurate assessments, who is in command of their situation, this person experiences uncertainty not just as uncomfortable but as a threat to identity. Not knowing what will happen, not being sure of someone's intentions, not being able to predict an outcome, these are not just epistemic discomforts. They are challenges to the self that must be resolved through the exercise of that self's defining capacity, thinking. Diffusion. Learning to watch the mind rather than be it. The path out of the identity trap is not the suppression of thought or the creation of a thought-free mind. It is what the ACT tradition calls diffusion, the development of a different relationship to one's thoughts, in which one can observe them as mental events rather than identifying with them as definitive descriptions of reality. From a diffused perspective, the thought, "I am a failure," is not a fact about oneself. It is an event in the mind, a combination of words and emotional associations that has been generated by the mental system under certain conditions and that will, if left alone, change and pass like any other mental event. The experience of observing the thought rather than being the thought is qualitatively different from ordinary conscious experience, and it requires practice to develop. But it is the practice that makes the difference between a mind that is constantly at the mercy of its own content and a mind that can acknowledge difficult thoughts without being ruled by them. This is not a technique. It is a different way of being with one's own mind, one that, paradoxically, requires giving up the identity of someone who thinks carefully about everything, in order to gain the freedom of a mind that can think when thinking is useful and rest when resting is appropriate. Chapter 6. Anxiety, Control, and the Illusion of Mental Preparedness. If you ask an overthinker why they keep replaying difficult scenarios, rehearsing possible confrontations, or mapping the landscape of things that could go wrong, they will typically tell you some version of the same thing. They are trying to be prepared. They are trying to prevent bad outcomes. They are trying to make sure they have thought of everything so that nothing catches them off guard. This explanation is not dishonest. It reflects a genuine, if often unconscious, belief about what the mental activity is accomplishing. But it is, in most cases, a misreading of what is actually happening, one that sustains the overthinking loop precisely because it provides an apparently rational justification for a process that is driven, at its core, by anxiety rather than by a genuine assessment of what preparation is necessary or effective. Anxiety and the illusion of control through thinking. Anxiety, at its most fundamental level, is a response to perceived threat combined with uncertainty about one's capacity to handle that threat. It is the emotional and physiological state that arises when the mind and nervous system detect a potential danger but do not have a clear plan for managing it. Anxiety motivates action, including, very specifically, the action of mental preparation. For creatures as cognitively sophisticated as humans, mental preparation is genuinely useful in many contexts. Thinking through a difficult conversation before having it, anticipating the questions an interviewer might ask, considering the possible complications of a plan. These are productive forms of mental preparation that genuinely reduce the probability of being caught unprepared. But anxiety is not reliably calibrated to the genuine utility of preparation. Anxiety responds to perceived threat, not to the actual probability or severity of threat. And the anxious mind, in its effort to manage the discomfort of uncertainty, generates mental activity far in excess of what any reasonable assessment of the situation would warrant. The key insight is this: the mental activity generated by anxiety is not primarily about preparation. It is primarily about managing the discomfort of anxiety itself. Thinking, reviewing, rehearsing, and planning all provide a temporary reduction in the acute discomfort of anxious uncertainty, a reduction that comes from the illusion of control that mental activity creates. When you are actively thinking about a potential problem, you feel as though you are doing something about it. The thinking is, in effect, a substitute for action in situations where no effective action is immediately possible. The control paradox. The relationship between control and overthinking involves a cruel paradox. The harder you try to control your mental experience through thinking, the more out of control that experience becomes. This is a specific instance of the broader paradox of control that appears in many areas of psychological functioning. Efforts to control anxiety often intensify it, because the monitoring required to detect and manage anxious thoughts keeps the threat detection system activated, which generates more anxiety. Efforts to control thoughts, as we have seen, typically activate those thoughts more strongly. Efforts to control interpersonal situations through excessive preparation and rehearsal often undermine the authenticity and spontaneity that make those situations go well. For the overthinker, this paradox creates a particularly difficult trap. The control-seeking mind, when confronted with evidence that its controlling is not working, that the overthinking is making things worse rather than better, often responds by generating more of the same. More analysis, more rehearsal, more attempts to model and manage the situation. The conclusion, "My control strategy is failing, therefore I need a different strategy," is preempted by the anxious mind's reflexive response, "My control strategy is failing, therefore I need to try harder." Breaking this loop requires something that is deeply counterintuitive for the control-oriented mind: the willingness to experience the anxiety without attempting to manage it through thought. This is not the same as being passive or giving up. It is the recognition that some forms of discomfort can only be worked through by being felt, not by being thought about, and that the felt experience, while temporarily more uncomfortable than the distancing that thinking provides, is ultimately far less sustained. Intolerance of uncertainty is the core vulnerability. Research by Michel Dugas and colleagues at the University of Quebec has identified intolerance of uncertainty (IU) as the central cognitive characteristic underlying generalized anxiety and worry. People with high IU respond to uncertain situations with disproportionate distress, not because they necessarily overestimate the probability of negative outcomes, but because the condition of not knowing is itself intolerable to them, regardless of how likely any particular outcome might be. For people with high intolerance of uncertainty, the function of worry, of overthinking, is specifically to reduce the felt sense of uncertainty. Not to eliminate the objective uncertainty, which is not within the power of thought to accomplish, but to create the subjective sense of having surveyed the possible future so thoroughly that one is, in some sense, present in all of them simultaneously. The worry covers the territory of the unknown. Having covered it, the person feels, temporarily, less exposed to the unexpected. This is why intolerance of uncertainty responds so poorly to reassurance. When a reassuring other tells the worried person that everything will probably be fine, they are addressing the probability estimate, which is not the actual source of distress. The source of distress is the uncertainty itself, the not knowing, and no reassurance about likely outcomes can eliminate that. The only thing that genuinely reduces IU is the repeated experience of encountering uncertain situations, tolerating the discomfort of not knowing, and discovering that the discomfort is manageable. This is experiential learning that cannot be achieved through thought, only through the willingness to be in the uncertain situation without the protective armor of mental preparation. Productive versus unproductive worry. Not all worry is equal, and one of the skills that emerges from understanding the function of overthinking is the ability to distinguish between productive and unproductive varieties. Productive worry is temporally bounded, action-oriented, and proportionate to the genuine level of threat. It generates a specific plan, a concrete action, or a clear decision, and then it stops, because it has accomplished its purpose. If you are worried about an upcoming medical procedure, productive worry might involve researching the procedure, asking your doctor specific questions, and arranging practical support. These are actions that genuinely reduce risk and uncertainty. Once taken, the worry has earned its cessation. Unproductive worry is open-ended, action-resistant, and disproportionate to the genuine level of threat. It does not generate a plan because no plan is possible, or because the feared outcome is not actually addressable by anything the worrier can do, or because the real function of the worry is anxiety management rather than problem solving. The person who lies awake worrying about a possible illness they have not been diagnosed with, about a relationship conflict they are not yet in, about a professional failure that has not yet occurred, this person is not engaged in productive preparation. They are using mental activity to manage the felt sense of vulnerability, and the thinking will continue until the underlying anxiety is addressed rather than managed. Chapter 7. The Social Brain, Overthinking in Relationships and What It Reveals. We are, before we are anything else, social creatures. The human brain evolved in the context of small, interdependent social groups, and it is profoundly specialized for the processing of social information. The same neural architecture that makes us capable of extraordinary cooperation, communication, and intimacy also makes us exquisitely sensitive to social threat, to rejection, exclusion, humiliation, and the loss of relational bonds that are, at the level of evolutionary programming, bound up with survival. This is why so much of overthinking is fundamentally social. When people report the content of their ruminative episodes, the overwhelming majority involves other people. What they think, what they said, what they meant, how they will respond, whether they are angry, whether they still care, whether we have irrevocably damaged our standing in their eyes. The overthinking mind is, in a very deep sense, a social mind, one that is processing the information most relevant to its most fundamental concerns. The social threat system and its triggers. Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman at UCLA have conducted extensive research on the neuroscience of social exclusion, with findings that are startling in their implications. Using neuroimaging, they demonstrated that the experience of social exclusion, being left out of a group activity, even in a trivial laboratory context, activates the same neural regions, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, that are activated by physical pain. Social exclusion, in a neurologically meaningful sense, hurts. This finding helps explain the intensity and tenacity of social overthinking. When the mind replays a moment of perceived social rejection, criticism, or exclusion, it is processing an event that the nervous system experienced as genuinely painful. The replaying is not irrational, it is the kind of attention that the nervous system devotes to painful events that carry survival-relevant information. The question the mind is implicitly asking, what does this mean for my belonging? What should I do differently to prevent it from happening again, is not a neurotic question. It is one of the most fundamental questions a social organism can ask. The problem, as throughout this book, is the mismatch between the sophistication of the threat and the sophistication of the response. The colleague who seemed slightly distracted during your presentation is probably just tired, not secretly harboring contempt for your competence. The friend who took 3 hours to respond to your message is probably just busy, not subtly signaling the withdrawal of their affection. The social threat system cannot always accurately calibrate the severity of the signal it is receiving, and the overthinker's mind, having received the signal, cannot easily be persuaded that the threat level is lower than it feels. Relationship overthinking. The loop of the unverifiable. Relationship overthinking has a specific quality that makes it particularly resistant to resolution. It almost always circles around questions that cannot be answered by thinking about them. Does she still love me? Is he secretly angry? Did I say the wrong thing? Are they pulling away? These questions require information that is only available from the other person, and often, even asking directly does not resolve them to the overthinker's satisfaction, because the overthinker may not trust that the answer they receive is the real one. This last point touches on one of the most painful features of anxious relational overthinking, the tendency to disbelieve reassurance. The partner who has been told 100 times, "I love you, I'm not going anywhere," and who still lies awake wondering whether this time the reassurance is genuine, this person is not choosing to doubt. Their nervous system, calibrated toward relational threat by early experience, simply cannot take in and fully register the information that safety is present. The reassurance lands on a system that is not configured to believe it. This is why the solution to relationship overthinking is almost never more information or more reassurance. It is the healing of the underlying relational anxiety, the update to the internal working model that allows the nervous system to genuinely register safety when it is present. And this update, as we will discuss in the final chapters, comes not through thinking but through experience, the repeated, embodied experience of secure connection with people who are genuinely reliable. The role of comparison in social rumination. A specific and particularly modern source of social overthinking is the practice of social comparison, the evaluation of one's own standing, worth, and performance relative to the actual or imagined performance of others. Social comparison is a natural and in some respects adaptive feature of social cognition. We use comparison with others to calibrate our own behavior, to identify opportunities for improvement, and to assess our standing in the communities that matter to us. But the same cognitive capacity that makes occasional, balanced comparison informative becomes, in the context of the overthinking mind, a source of chronic dissatisfaction and ruminative distress. Contemporary social environments, and social media in particular, have created conditions that are extraordinarily fertile for unproductive social comparison. The curated self-presentations of social media provide an endless supply of idealized images against which the overthinker's unidealized reality can be unfavorably compared. The global scale of modern visibility means that one can now compare oneself not to the dozen or so people in one's immediate social circle, as was the case for most of human evolutionary history, but to the millions of most impressive seeming individuals whose achievements are broadcast globally. The result is a comparison landscape so heavily biased toward the exceptional and the aspirational that virtually any honest self-assessment must result in the uncomfortable awareness of falling short. For the overthinker, this awareness does not sit quietly. It generates the same ruminative processing that any threat-relevant information generates. What does this mean about me? How do I measure up? What do I need to do differently to close the gap? And because the gap is, in a structural sense, impossible to close, there will always be someone more impressive to compare oneself to. The overthinking generated by social comparison is essentially inexhaustible. The mind reader's trap. Related to but distinct from social comparison is what we might call the mind reader's trap, the chronic habit of attempting to determine what others are thinking and feeling about us, and the overthinking that this habit generates. Humans are, by nature, intensely interested in the minds of others. The capacity for mentalizing, for modeling the mental states of other people, is one of the most distinctive and sophisticated features of human cognition, and it underlies our ability to cooperate, communicate, and connect. But this capacity, like all cognitive capacities, can be deployed in ways that are adaptive and ways that are not. The adaptive deployment of mentalizing involves taking others' perspectives seriously and using them to inform our understanding of situations and our behavior toward others. The maladaptive deployment involves spending enormous mental energy attempting to determine, with high certainty, what someone else is thinking and feeling about us, on the basis of ambiguous evidence, through the distorting lens of our own fears and insecurities, and without the ability to verify our conclusions through direct access to the other person's mental state. The mind reader's trap is particularly common in people with anxious attachment, high social sensitivity, or a history of living in unpredictable social environments where accurately reading others' states was a genuine matter of safety. For these people, the attempt to know what others are thinking feels not like neurotic obsession but like an entirely reasonable survival strategy. And in some environments, it genuinely was one. The challenge of adulthood is learning to distinguish between the environments where hypervigilant social monitoring was adaptive and the typically much safer environments of adult life, where it generates suffering without benefit. Chapter 8. The Biology of the Busy Mind, Hormones, Sleep, and the Nervous System. Up to this point, this book has focused primarily on the psychological dimensions of overthinking, the attachment patterns, the identity structures, the cognitive styles, the emotional dynamics. But the busy mind does not operate in a vacuum. It is embedded in a body with its own hormonal rhythms, its own sleep architecture, its own nutritional requirements, and its own autonomic nervous system. And the state of that body has profound effects on the mind's propensity for rumination. This chapter examines the biological substrate of overthinking, the ways in which the body's physical state either feeds or quiets the ruminative mind, and the practical implications of this understanding for people who want to break the cycle from the ground up. Cortisol, the chemistry of chronically wired. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, produced by the adrenal glands in response to activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal (HPA) axis, is simultaneously a vital regulator of the stress response and, when chronically elevated, one of the most damaging hormones in the body and brain. In acute stress situations, cortisol is your ally. It mobilizes glucose for energy, sharpens attention, and prepares the body for the action that the stressful situation demands. Once the stressor has passed, cortisol levels should decline, the stress response should deactivate, and the system should return to baseline. But in conditions of chronic stress, the low-grade, persistent stress of modern life, of relational conflict, of professional pressure, of financial worry, of social anxiety, cortisol levels do not reliably decline. They remain elevated, creating a physiological state that is continuously oriented toward vigilance and threat processing. And elevated cortisol, as we have noted, directly impairs the prefrontal cortex's capacity for rational, regulated thought, the very capacity needed to evaluate and quiet the ruminative loop. The relationship between cortisol and overthinking is bidirectional and self-reinforcing. Cortisol elevation generates the physiological state that promotes ruminative thinking, and ruminative thinking, which the nervous system processes as ongoing threat, maintains elevated cortisol. The chemical and the cognitive loop each feed the other, creating a biological as well as psychological basis for the chronicity of overthinking. Sleep and the nocturnal mind. There is a reason that the most intense episodes of overthinking so often occur at night, particularly in the hours between midnight and dawn. The relationship between sleep and overthinking is bidirectional and mutually reinforcing in ways that create one of the most stubborn cycles in the psychological landscape of the restless mind. Overthinking interferes with sleep in multiple ways. The cognitive and emotional arousal of rumination is directly incompatible with the physiological quieting required for sleep onset. The cortisol elevation that accompanies anxiety, which is highest in the early morning hours as part of the normal cortisol awakening response, makes early morning waking common for anxious ruminators. And the content of ruminative thinking, the replaying of distressing events, the modeling of threatening futures, activates emotional responses that further elevate arousal and delay sleep. Sleep deprivation, in turn, dramatically worsens overthinking. The prefrontal cortex, already the most vulnerable brain region to stress-related impairment, is exquisitely sensitive to sleep loss. Even moderate sleep deprivation, 6 hours per night rather than the recommended 7 to 9, produces measurable impairment in executive function, emotional regulation, and the suppression of intrusive thoughts. The amygdala, conversely, becomes hyperreactive under sleep deprivation, more sensitive to threat, more prone to strong emotional responses, less effectively regulated by prefrontal control. Research by E.T.I. Ben Simon and Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, has provided particularly striking evidence of this sleep-emotion interaction. In brain imaging studies, sleep-deprived participants showed amygdala responses to negative images that were 60% more reactive than those of rested participants, and the connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which normally provides top-down regulation, was dramatically reduced. The sleep-deprived brain is, in a meaningful sense, an overthinking brain, more reactive to threat, less capable of regulating that reactivity, and more prone to the ruminative loops that characterize anxiety and depression. The autonomic nervous system and the window of tolerance. The autonomic nervous system, ANS, the component of the nervous system that regulates involuntary physiological functions including heart rate, breathing, digestion, and the stress response, provides another important lens through which to understand the biology of overthinking. The ANS has two primary branches: the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, which activates the body's stress response and prepares it for action, and the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS, which promotes the states of calm, rest, and restoration associated with safety and recovery. A well-regulated ANS is one that transitions flexibly between these states in response to the genuine demands of the environment, activating when action is required, recovering when the threat has passed. Dan Siegel's concept of the window of tolerance describes the zone of arousal within which the nervous system functions optimally, alert enough for effective engagement with the environment, but not so activated that it is overwhelmed or shut down. Within this window, thinking is clear, emotions are manageable, and the person can respond to the demands of the moment with appropriate flexibility. Chronic overthinking is associated with either sustained hyperarousal, the nervous system stuck in a high activation state, or a pattern of rapid oscillation between hyperarousal and hypoarousal shutdown. In either case, the window of tolerance is narrow, and small stressors are sufficient to push the person outside it. A mind that is chronically outside its window of tolerance, perpetually too activated for calm deliberation, is a mind that will default to its most primitive, most automatic, most defensive cognitive patterns: rumination, catastrophizing, and hypervigilant social monitoring. Hormonal cycles, nutrition, and the overthinking body. Several other biological factors are worth noting as contributors to the variability of overthinking across time and individuals. Hormonal cycles, particularly the fluctuations of estrogen and progesterone across the menstrual cycle, have well-documented effects on mood, anxiety, and rumination. Research has consistently found that rumination and anxiety increase in the premenstrual phase, the late luteal phase of the cycle, when progesterone drops precipitously and estrogen levels are also declining. Women who already have a tendency toward anxiety and overthinking often report that their ruminative patterns are dramatically worse in this phase, a pattern that is not psychosomatic but directly reflects the hormonal modulation of the neurotransmitter systems, particularly serotonin and GABA, that regulate mood and anxiety. Nutritional factors, while often overlooked in psychological accounts of overthinking, also play a meaningful role. Blood glucose regulation affects cognitive function broadly, including the executive functions of the prefrontal cortex that normally regulate emotional and ruminative responses. Deficiencies in key nutrients, magnesium, B vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, have been associated with increased anxiety and impaired mood regulation. The gut-brain axis, mediated largely by the vagus nerve and by the trillions of microorganisms in the gut microbiome, provides another pathway through which the state of the body influences the state of the mind. None of this means that overthinking is reducible to biology or that biological interventions are sufficient on their own. But it does mean that attempts to address overthinking purely through psychological means, through changing thoughts or behaviors, that ignore the biological substrate in which those thoughts and behaviors are embedded will be less effective than integrated approaches that attend to the body as well as the mind. Chapter 9. Cultural and Environmental Accelerants of Overthinking. The biological and psychological factors we have examined so far are not sufficient, on their own, to explain the apparent epidemic of overthinking in contemporary life. While human neurobiology and early attachment experiences provide the foundation for the overthinking tendency, the particular forms it takes, the severity with which it manifests, and the cultural meanings that organize our relationship to it are shaped powerfully by the social and environmental context in which people live. This chapter examines the cultural and environmental accelerants of overthinking, the features of contemporary life that amplify the tendencies that biology and early experience create, and that make the problem of overthinking significantly worse in the present moment than it might have been in different historical or cultural contexts. The age of infinite information and finite attention. We live in a period of unprecedented information abundance. The volume of information available to any connected individual exceeds, by orders of magnitude, anything that any previous generation of humans has had access to. News from every corner of the world is available in real time. Every question can be researched within seconds. Every opinion, every fear, every possible perspective on every possible situation is available on demand, in quantities that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. For the overthinking mind, this represents an extraordinary and largely unrecognized form of environmental amplification. The ruminative thought that would previously have had to operate with limited material, the actual events of one's actual life and the memories associated with them, now has access to an unlimited supply of additional material to incorporate. The person worried about a health symptom can now research that symptom against the backdrop of every possible disease that has ever produced it. The person anxious about their child's development can compare that development against every possible developmental trajectory documented anywhere on the internet. The person anxious about their relationship can read endless accounts of relationship failure and find ample evidence for their worst fears. The information environment of the 21st century is, in a meaningful sense, tailor-made for overthinking. It provides not just more material for ruminative processing but a continuous supply of novelty, new threats, new comparisons, new reasons for anxiety, that prevents the mind from reaching the exhaustion-based cessation of rumination that might otherwise occur. The overthinking loop that might previously have run for an hour can now run indefinitely, continuously refreshed by new inputs. Social media and the comparison machine. Social media warrants specific attention as an accelerant of overthinking, beyond its role in information abundance. The comparison dynamics we discussed in the previous chapter are dramatically amplified by the architecture of social media platforms, which are designed, at a commercial level, to maximize engagement, and which have discovered that engagement is most reliably generated by content that evokes strong emotion, including the strong emotions of envy, inadequacy, and social anxiety. The social media feed presents a curated, edited, and optimized version of other people's lives, their most attractive photos, their most impressive achievements, their happiest moments, their most thoughtful insights. This is not dishonesty on the part of the individuals sharing, it is a natural consequence of the social dynamics of public self-presentation. But it creates a systematic bias in the comparison landscape. The viewer is comparing their unedited, complete, unimpressive seeming inner life to the most impressive external presentations of everyone they follow. For the overthinker, this comparison landscape generates a specific and particularly insidious form of rumination, the questioning of one's own life, choices, relationships, and worth in light of the implicitly communicated standards of an idealized social world that does not, in the form presented, actually exist. The woman who sees 100 images of apparently effortless domestic grace and professional success is not comparing herself to real people. She is comparing herself to a constructed ideal that real people have assembled from their very best moments and presented as their ordinary reality. Research on social media use and mental health has consistently found associations between heavy social media use and increased anxiety, depression, and negative affect, associations that are particularly strong among young people and that are partly mediated by exactly the comparison and social monitoring processes we have been discussing. The technology that was sold as a tool for connection has become, for many users, an engine of social anxiety and ruminative self-evaluation. The productivity culture and the war on rest. Contemporary Western culture, particularly the Anglo-American professional culture that increasingly globalizes itself, has a profoundly ambivalent relationship with mental rest. On one hand, the discourse of wellness and self-care has become ubiquitous. On the other, the actual structure of professional life and the values it embodies continue to reward relentless productivity and penalize anything that looks like idleness. The cultural message that pervades professional life is one that the overthinker receives and amplifies: time not spent being productive is time wasted. Rest without purpose is self-indulgence. A mind that is not engaged with a problem, a plan, or a task is a mind that is failing to contribute. This message, which is absorbed not just consciously but through the entire structure of incentives and social norms that govern professional life, makes the quiet mind not just elusive but culturally suspect. For people with a pre-existing tendency toward overthinking, this cultural context is deeply reinforcing. The ruminative mind that keeps itself busy with problem solving, future planning, and analytical review can present itself, to itself and to others, as a productive, conscientious, hardworking mind. The suffering that the busyness generates is a private experience that does not disrupt the performance of diligence. And the cultural valorization of busyness provides an additional layer of justification for the overthinking. If thinking hard about things is good, then thinking very hard about many things all the time must be even better. The alternative, the cultivated, practiced, purposeful cultivation of mental stillness, is not rewarded by professional culture, is poorly understood by most people who have never experienced it, and requires a willingness to experience the initial discomfort of a mind that is accustomed to constant activity suddenly encountering its own silence. This discomfort is real and should not be minimized. But the culture of productivity does not help people develop the tolerance for it, and without that tolerance, the overthinking mind has no safe haven to rest in. The medicalization of the inner life. A final cultural factor worth examining is the increasing medicalization of psychological distress in contemporary Western culture, the tendency to understand emotional difficulty primarily through a biomedical lens and to treat it primarily through pharmacological means. This is a nuanced issue. Medications for anxiety and depression can be genuinely helpful and even life-saving for people in severe psychological distress, and the historical stigmatization of mental health treatment has done enormous harm by preventing people from seeking help they need. There is no argument here against appropriate medical intervention for genuine clinical conditions. The concern, rather, is with the cultural effect of framing all psychological difficulty in exclusively medical terms, of defining anxiety and overthinking as brain diseases that happen to people, rather than as understandable responses to early experience and current circumstance that require understanding and growth. When the primary cultural message about overthinking is, "You have a chemical imbalance that needs to be corrected by medication," this message, however well-intentioned, may actually make the deeper work harder by implying that the path to freedom is external correction rather than internal transformation. The people who recover most fully from chronic overthinking typically do so through a combination of factors, sometimes including medication, but always including the development of insight into the sources of their rumination, the cultivation of emotional processing capacity, the healing of early relational wounds, and the development of new habits of mind and body. These are not pharmaceutical achievements. They are the fruits of genuine psychological development, and a cultural framework that reduces all psychological distress to brain chemistry is one that, however inadvertently, discourages people from undertaking that development. Chapter 10. Breaking Free, the Integrated Path to a Quieter Mind. Everything in the preceding 9 chapters has been building toward this one: what to actually do. Not the quick fix, the 10-second breathing technique or the positive affirmation that temporarily interrupts the loop, but the genuine, sustained, integrated work of developing a different relationship with one's own mind. The kind of change that, instead of trying to stop the overthinking from the outside, addresses the conditions from which the overthinking emerges. This chapter will not be a list of techniques in any conventional sense. Techniques are useful, and specific practices will be described here. But they are useful only in the context of a larger understanding, an understanding of why the mind overthinks, what it is looking for, and what genuine resolution feels like. Without that understanding, techniques are like mopping the floor while the tap is still running, useful for a moment, insufficient as a lasting solution. The path described here draws on multiple traditions and evidence bases: cognitive behavioral therapy and its modern derivatives, acceptance and commitment therapy, somatic approaches to trauma and emotional processing, relational approaches to healing attachment wounds, mindfulness and contemplative traditions, and the emerging science of neuroplasticity. These are not competing approaches. They are complementary ones, each addressing a different level of the multi-layered problem of overthinking. First foundation: understanding your specific pattern. The most important first step in breaking the overthinking loop is understanding, with some precision, your own particular version of it. Overthinking is not a single, uniform phenomenon. It expresses itself differently depending on the individual's history, temperament, attachment style, and core beliefs. The anxiously attached person's overthinking is organized around different content and different fears than the perfectionist's overthinking, which differs again from the trauma survivors, the approval seekers, or the control-focused persons. One of the most useful exercises you can undertake is the development of what therapists call a case conceptualization of your own overthinking, a personal map that traces the connections between your current ruminative patterns and their historical sources. This involves asking a series of questions that you may not have previously considered together. What are the specific situations or triggers that reliably initiate the overthinking loop? What are the most common themes or contents of your rumination: failure, rejection, loss, inadequacy, control? What early experiences, with caregivers, with the social world, with your own emotional life, created the vulnerabilities that these themes exploit? What do you believe, at the deepest level, about yourself and about the world that makes the content of the overthinking feel so threatening? This kind of self-mapping does not require a therapist, though a skilled therapist can be enormously helpful in conducting it. It requires honesty, patience, and the willingness to connect the dots between present suffering and past experience in ways that may initially feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Second foundation: processing the emotion beneath the thought. Given the central argument of this book, that overthinking is fundamentally an emotional phenomenon, driven by feelings that have not been processed, the most direct path to reducing overthinking is the development of a capacity for genuine emotional processing. Emotional processing is not the same as emotional expression, though expression is sometimes part of it. It is not the same as talking about feelings, though talk therapy can facilitate it. It is not the same as understanding one's feelings conceptually, which is available to the overthinking mind without requiring any actual feeling. Emotional processing is the experience of feeling, of allowing a feeling to arise in the body, to be present in its full quality, and to move through and complete itself in the way that feelings naturally do when they are allowed to do so. One of the most counterintuitive discoveries available to the chronic overthinker is that feelings, when actually felt, are much briefer than the thoughts that circle around them. The grief that the mind has been trying to manage through analysis for 3 years may, when actually felt in the body, last 20 minutes of genuine engagement before it begins to shift. The anger that has been converted into endless rumination about fairness and justice may, when allowed direct expression in a safe context, be discharged in a matter of moments. The fear that has been projected into thousands of catastrophic scenarios may, when turned toward and acknowledged, reveal itself as something smaller and more survivable than the catastrophes it has been generating. This is the promise and the challenge of emotional processing. It requires a temporary increase in discomfort, the willingness to feel what has been avoided, in exchange for a more lasting reduction in the chronic suffering of the overthinking loop. For people who have spent years developing the cognitive strategies that keep their feelings at bay, this willingness does not come easily. It is the most important and the most difficult work in breaking the cycle. Practical supports for emotional processing include somatic practices that increase body awareness and tolerance of physical sensation, yoga, body scan meditation, somatic experiencing therapy, relational contexts of sufficient safety to allow emotional vulnerability, close friendships, therapeutic relationships, intimate partnerships where both people have developed emotional literacy, expressive arts, journaling, creative writing, visual art, music that create a structured container for emotional material, and mindfulness practices that develop the capacity to be present with experience without immediately converting it into thought. Third foundation, healing the relational wounds. For those whose overthinking is rooted in insecure attachment, in the early relational experiences that shape the nervous system's relationship with uncertainty, closeness, and self-worth, genuine healing requires genuine relational experience. The working models that drive anxious, avoidant, or fearful patterns were built in relationship, and they are most effectively updated in relationship. This does not mean that individual self-work is useless. It is genuinely valuable, and much of what this book describes can be practiced individually. But the deepest healing of attachment wounds typically requires the experience of a relationship that is qualitatively different from the relationships that created the wound. One that offers consistent, reliable, attuned responsiveness. One that maintains care through rupture and repair. One in which the person can gradually take the risk of genuine emotional exposure and discover that the expected catastrophe does not materialize. Such relationships can be found in good psychotherapy, in deeply trusted friendships, in intimate partnerships where both people are committed to genuine emotional presence, and sometimes in spiritual communities that offer a grounding sense of being known and accepted. The key qualities, in whatever relational context they are found, are safety. The relationship is consistently non-threatening. Attunement. The other person genuinely tracks and responds to the person's actual experience. Reliability. The connection is consistent enough to be internalized over time, and the possibility of repair. When things go wrong, they can be addressed and mended rather than leading to abandonment. Over time, repeated experience of these qualities begins to update the internal working model, to lay down new neural pathways that carry the expectation of safety rather than the expectation of threat. This is slow work. The patterns being updated are old, deeply grooved, and strongly associated with identity and survival. But neuroplasticity makes it possible, and the direction of change is consistent, toward the nervous system's capacity to register safety when safety is genuinely present, and toward the quieting of the ruminative loop that safety produces. Fourth foundation, restructuring the identity. The identity dimensions of overthinking, the equation of self with thought, the organization of identity around performance or approval, the need for certainty as a self-protective strategy, require a different kind of work. The development of a more stable, more flexible, more internally grounded sense of self that does not depend on the quality of one's thoughts for its foundation. This is work that draws heavily on the contemplative traditions, on the Buddhist concept of anatta, non-self, and its recognition that the sense of a fixed, essential self is a construction that creates more suffering than it relieves, on the Stoic practice of distinguishing between what is and is not within one's control and releasing attachment to the former, on the existentialist insight that identity is not given but chosen through repeated action, and on the psychological concept of self-compassion. Developed most thoroughly by Kristin Neff, which involves treating oneself with the kindness, care, and understanding that one would offer a good friend. Self-compassion deserves particular attention because it directly addresses the shame and self-criticism that fuel so much perfectionist overthinking. Neff's research has consistently demonstrated that self-compassion, which consists of self-kindness, treating oneself gently when suffering, common humanity, recognizing that suffering and imperfection are universal human experiences rather than personal failures, and mindfulness, maintaining awareness of difficult experiences without over-identification, is associated with lower levels of anxiety, depression, rumination, and perfectionism, and with higher levels of emotional resilience and psychological well-being. The cultivation of self-compassion does not mean lowering standards or accepting poor performance. Research consistently shows that self-compassionate people are equally or more motivated to improve than self-critical people, and that they are better able to learn from failures because they are not consumed by the shame that self-criticism generates. Self-compassion is, in a meaningful sense, the emotional climate within which genuine growth is most possible, because it provides the safety that allows honest self-assessment without the defensive reaction that shame provokes. Fifth foundation: working with the biology. Given the biological substrate of overthinking, the role of cortisol, sleep, the autonomic nervous system, hormones, and nutrition, a comprehensive approach to breaking the cycle must include attention to the body. Sleep is the highest leverage biological intervention available for most people. The research is unambiguous. Adequate, high-quality sleep is among the most powerful regulators of emotional reactivity and ruminative tendency. Protecting sleep. Through consistent sleep timing, a pre-sleep environment designed for rest rather than stimulation, the management of caffeine and alcohol consumption, and the practice of transitional rituals that signal to the nervous system that the day is over and rest is appropriate, is not a luxury. It is, for the chronic overthinker, a therapeutic necessity. Cardiovascular exercise has extensive and well-replicated evidence for its effects on anxiety, mood, and rumination. Exercise reduces cortisol levels, increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that promotes neural growth and connectivity, improves sleep quality, and provides a physical outlet for the physiological arousal that the stress response generates. Studies by Andrea Nierenberg and others have found that regular aerobic exercise is as effective as antidepressant medication for mild to moderate depression, an effect mediated in part by exercise's impact on the neural systems that regulate mood and anxiety. Breath and body practices, yoga, tai chi, qigong, somatic experiencing, progressive muscle relaxation, work directly with the autonomic nervous system to shift the balance from sympathetic, stress activation toward parasympathetic, rest activation. The vagal nerve, which connects the brain to the body and is the primary pathway of parasympathetic regulation, is directly stimulated by slow, deep breathing, by humming and singing, by social engagement, and by certain forms of movement. Practices that work with these vagal pathways are among the most direct physiological interventions available for the chronically activated nervous system of the chronic overthinker. Sixth foundation: mindfulness is a way of being. Mindfulness, defined most precisely as the quality of open, non-judgmental, present moment awareness, deserves its own consideration as a foundation of the integrated approach to overthinking, not merely as a technique but as a cultivated way of being with one's own experience. The misconception about mindfulness that is most relevant to our subject is the idea that mindfulness means making the mind quiet, that a successful mindfulness practice is one in which thoughts stop or significantly diminish. This misconception leads to enormous frustration in beginning practitioners, who sit down to meditate and discover that their minds are extraordinarily busy, and who conclude that they are bad at mindfulness and give up. Mindfulness does not make the mind quiet. What it develops, over time, is a different relationship to the mind's activity, the capacity to observe thoughts, feelings, and sensations as they arise and pass without immediately becoming identified with them, reacting to them, or following them down the rabbit hole of associated thoughts that constitutes the overthinking loop. The meditator who notices, "I'm thinking about the conversation again," and can return to the present experience of breath or sensation without lengthy self-criticism about the fact of having thought, This meditator is practicing mindfulness, regardless of how many times the mind wanders. The neurological effects of sustained mindfulness practice are well documented. Long-term meditators show reduced activity in the default mode network's ruminative circuitry, improved connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, supporting better emotional regulation, increased gray matter density in regions associated with emotional regulation and awareness, and reduced amygdala reactivity to emotional stimuli. These changes are not instantaneous. They develop over months and years of consistent practice, but they are robust, replicated, and consistent with the phenomenological reports of long-term practitioners who describe a genuinely different relationship to their own mental activity. It is important to emphasize that mindfulness is not a cure for overthinking in the sense that antibiotics are a cure for bacterial infection. It is a practice, a way of training the mind that, over time, changes its default patterns of operation. The change is gradual, non-linear, and requires sustained engagement. But for many people, the development of a genuine mindfulness practice has been the single most transformative factor in their relationship with their own restless minds. Seventh foundation: environmental design. Finally, the integrated approach to overthinking must attend to the environment, both the physical and the social environment, in which the overthinking mind operates. Even the most internally resourced, most therapeutically processed, most mindfully practiced individual will struggle to maintain a quiet mind in an environment that is continuously and deliberately designed to activate the threat detection system, promote social comparison, and prevent the experience of genuine rest. Environmental design for the overthinking mind involves several practical commitments. It involves managing the information environment, being deliberate and disciplined about the quantity and quality of information one consumes, and particularly about social media use, news consumption, and the general availability of stimuli that feed the ruminative loop. This is not censorship or avoidance. It is the recognition that attention is a finite resource, and that what one attends to shapes what the mind does when left to its own devices. It involves designing regular periods of genuine unplugged rest, not the pseudo-rest of scrolling through a phone while half watching television, but the genuine mental disengagement that allows the mind to process, consolidate, and restore. Walking in nature, spending time in conversation without screens, engaging in creative activities that absorb attention without generating anxiety, these are not indulgences. For the overthinking mind, they are therapeutic necessities. It involves cultivating relationships, the kinds of relationships that provide genuine safety, warmth, and attunement, and investing in those relationships with the care they require to grow. The social brain that is chronically anxious about its relational standing does not need better social strategy. It needs genuine connection with people who are consistently kind and reliably present, and the willingness to allow that connection to update the nervous system's expectations of what relationships can offer. And it involves the cultivation of meaning, engagement with activities, causes, relationships, and pursuits that feel genuinely important, that connect the individual to something larger than the concerns of the ruminating self. Viktor Frankl, who developed his meaning-centered psychology in the extraordinary context of Nazi concentration camps, observed that those who maintained a sense of meaning were better able to endure and psychologically survive extreme suffering. This observation has been extensively validated in more ordinary contexts. Meaning acts as an organizing principle for the self that is larger than the overthinking loop, and engagement with meaningful activity provides the kind of absorbed, present, self-transcending experience that naturally quiets the ruminating mind.